Anyway, welcome once again, folks, and we are particularly thrilled to have John Tauranac as our guest here. As I was showing you New York's first subway map, it's very appropriate that we have a living, breathing maker of maps, and not only that, maker of subway maps. John Tauranac was the leading cartographer with the MTA when what is considered the last great redesign of the subway map emerged in 1978. And in many ways, the subway maps that we know, even digitally, are heirs of that map. However, and John has continued his cartographic efforts in regard to the subway and other aspects of mapping New York City through various printed versions that he's published after he left the MTA. And in fact, in 1990, published a subway map that could be considered in competition with the map that he just had completed in 1978 for the MTA. We'll get to that. But John is also one of New York City's eminent architectural historians. I like to think of him as the great cataloger of New York's buildings and great observers of this city. And he's published several highly regarded books. One of favorite is New York from the Air, which also involved the photography, stunning photography of Jan Auteurs Bertrand, which is one of the most beautiful books on New York City you will ever see. Other books of his of architectural interest are a definitive study of the Empire State Building, a book called Elegant New York, Builders and Buildings of New York from 1885 to 1915. And his map-making and architectural interests are combined in a street atlas called Block by Block, which is now in its 6th edition, I believe. Demonstrates that the printed map is very much alive, and it is a guide to what buildings can be found on every block in New York City. And and John also is
adjunct associate professor.
Adjunct associate professor at NYU in these fields, has also guided many tours of the city. To get us started, I'd like to take us back to the 1970s. The 70s were a big decade for the mapping of the New York subway system. In 1971, a bold subway map was designed by an internationally renowned Italian designer, Massimo Vignelli, and it was a map that was in a bright, modernist, schematic, bit of Peter Max kind of fashion. I've tastefully hidden it behind John's book because this was the great rival to John's approaching to mapping the subway. So fast forward to 1978, and this is 1 year after the Son of Sam and the Bronx riots and the Great New York Blackout. These happened in 1977, and a similarly tumultuous event happened at Cooper Union in 1978, where native New Yorker John Tauranac, map maker, takes on the internationally known, probably better dressed, Massimo Vignelli to debate the merits of approaching mapping the subway. John, what was that all about?
In how many words or few? I screwed up every ounce of courage I had to get on that stage. I actually held back though.
And what was the?
I did not let my real bile get spilled out.
I've heard some quotes.
Yeah, well, this was 72,
72.
to be pedantic.
Go ahead.
But the first thing that I did when I saw this map was go to my then favorite subway map, the 1948 Hagster map. And I tried to draw this color coding system on a quasi-geographic map. And I realized that you couldn't accommodate all these colors in Midtown without distorting the reality of geography.
But one might say, so what?
Well,
Because we're looking at the map to see the subway line.
subway lines, right. Well, my belief is that you should try to put the subway in perspective of the city it serves.
Okay.
And putting it in a void is not a good thing.
Okay.
Also, you talked about the problems in the city in the 70s. This map reflects a certain cynical reality. What are the cartographic verities for water? Ask any 6th grade class. You know what, we'll shoot hands. Blue!
Hatred.
What is the color for parks?
Green.
Green. Well, here we have gray parks and beige water. And you talk about reflecting a cynical reality, this is it. Also, it might be very democratic, but Vignelli created all stations equal. Well, they ain't. Some stations are express, others are local, some is a combination express and local. Some have some trains stopping at them sometimes, other trains stopping at them other times. Here all you see on the lines is a dot. It doesn't tell you anything. And I've always said that Vignelli had taken his idea from this map, from the London map of the 1930s, which is schematic, and was the first schematic subway map. Even the London Underground map shows part-time service in a dashed line, for instance. It shows service that doesn't stop on Sunday mornings in a different fashion than if it stops there. Well, we can't say 24/7, because they shut down at night. But Vignelli ignored the reality of riding the subway. And I felt it was a great disservice. Let this map hang on the walls of the Museum of Modern Art. Oops, I'm sorry. I don't need to be that discriminating. Let it hang on the walls of the Museum of Modern Art, just not on the walls of the subway platform or in your pocket.
Well, obviously your view prevailed. So was this public debate an aid in getting your more geographic view of the subway?
Indeed. Also, there was a gathering on 53rd Street named City Anna, which specialized in New York stuff. and it was operated by a fellow named who also does publishing, etc. And he volunteered to have a show of subway maps, and I guess I would use a word to describe my role. I curated it, which meant I had every word, every label. And we arranged the maps chronologically. We didn't have your beautiful map on your wall here. We started in 1910. We didn't know about the Wanamaker map. We started in 1910 and went through chronologically, and we showed a test map of what we were proposing. And the test map does not reflect what I feel is the panache that the finished 1979
Right.
had. In part because, remember my problem with making a geographic map with all these colors? I could not convince the Transit Authority that we should come up with a new color coding system based on trunk lines. Think of the think of a tree. You have the trunk, and you have roots down there, and you have branches up there. Well, that's the way a subway or a railroad operates ordinarily. And London, the London Underground, is a trunk line color coding system. So Vignelli might have gone to London for his iteration of the London map. I went to London for our iteration, came up with a trunk line color coding system. And I was saying earlier that I didn't care what color was ascribed to which line, but I found it fascinating that the green line went up the Upper East Side where the money is, and the red line went up the Upper West Side where all the common simps were, on an Upper West Side or so.
So who makes the call on the colors?
That was a blue
Well,
collar line. The
it
Upper
was-
West Side was a blue collar line. It's because the A train was blue.
Well, that's interesting. Up in Hamilton Heights and Washington Heights,
Yeah. It's
not
right.
on Central Park West.
No. Talking about Washington Heights.
How did we arrive at the colors? There was the head of public affairs at the Transit Authority was a fellow named Len Ingalls, who was a former Times reporter.
Could you say his name again?
Pardon me?
Can you talk a little louder?
Can I talk a little
Is your
louder?
microphone?
I can try.
I didn't hear the name. Did you say?
I might lose.
Len Ingalls. Right.
His name was Len Ingalls. And in representing the Transit Authority, he realized that we would have to change every piece of subway signage there was. Because if you were to go into the 72nd Street Broadway subway station, there would be three colors. There'd be orange for the one, red for the two, and light blue for the three. Well, that would become one color, red for 1, 2, and 3. So he said we had to try to salvage as many colors as we could. So what's the, you mentioned the A train.
A and
The
C.
A train under this color coding system was dark blue.
Yeah.
So the 8th Avenue line became dark blue. The West Side IRT had the number 2 Express, which was red. That became red. Lexington Avenue line, it didn't have green, but that was what we tried to do. So that's how we arrived at the colors.
Can I say, my grandparents grew up in New York and my parents grew up in New York. They always considered the A line the blue collar line.
John, why did the subway system want new maps at the time you were working on this?
Why?
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. I wasn't the only person in 1972 who threw up his hands in despair when he saw that. There was a committee created, headed by a woman named Arlene Bronzaft. She taught psychology at Lehman College. And Arlene Bronzaft was known as one of the most vocal rail enthusiasts in the city. not just the most vocal, but the loudest. And she finally got the ear of Chairman Harold Fisher, who was, maybe it was David, it must have been David Unish, who was the chairman then. And a committee was created. And it was not an easy task because of politics, internal divisions. The Transit Authority is a division of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, which is a state agency. And then there's MAPSTOA, the Manhattan Bus Transit Surface Operating Authority. I mean, you know, these acronyms went on and on and on. But Arlene Bronzak really got it together. There was it must have been David Unish who was the chairman at the time. You know, he had been at Macy's, and he believed in merchandising the product. So he thought that a new and more realistic map might be the solution to one of many problems.
John, I hate it when I hear people refer to the lines by color. They'll say, I'm taking the green line. I'm a New Yorker, that's the Lexington Avenue line, you know? And I still use IRT and BMT and IND, and this is, I say it's an artifact of the map. It's not.
Well, I have mixed emotions about it. Like you, I talk about taking the west side of IRT. But when I hear somebody say, well, it's easy, you know, just take the red line from 8060 to Times Square and transfer the yellow line to Union Square, I think, that sounds so easy.
It's easier, but that's part of the reason I dislike it. I say Boston's got a green line. We don't.
Okay, let's move forward to 1990. And you left the MTA.
I was declared redundant.
You were declared redundant. But yet in 1990, you had the chutzpah, shall we say, to publish a map to compete with that of the MTA.
Right.
So what is going to be so much better about the 1990 map?
Well, one of the things I did on that map was show the system in a quasi-geographic depiction. The 1979 map did have a breakthrough vis-a-vis in that the subway stations were identified as being either express or local. And each subway station had not just the name of the primary name of the station, but it had the service that stopped there under it. And it was in, I forget what the configuration was, but it was
I can imagine the subway map without that.
Yeah, well, here. So if a line stopped there from 6 a.m. till 12 a.m., it would have been in bold-faced time. I'm just making this. If it only stopped there part-time, it would be in light italic. So you would know that if a line is always going to stop at the station. The definition is, when is part-time service? Does that mean weekdays only? Rush hours towards the central business district in the mornings and away from the evenings? Or does it mean weekends only, etc.? So in 1990, I set out to have this quasi-geographic map. And one of the changes I made was to put the service right on the line itself. So if you were, I don't know, 96th and Broadway, I would have a circle to indicate an express station in the color of the line, and I would have the 1 in boldface, I would have the 2 in boldface, and I have the 3 in light italic, because it didn't stop there all the time.
So it made the map more versatile,
Easy to read, yes.
easier to
You
read?
could just go, go up.
More information, more easily read?
Yes, and also, I made sure that the street of operation was secondary to the primary name of the station. Because if you just see 96th Street in a red line, you might find the name Broadway running alongside the line, but that's not all that didactic, and you have to telegraph the information.
So, since 1990, you've continued to publish even more than one different paper subway map. And are there digital versions, or how does the paper subway map manage to survive in the age of Google Maps?
To answer your question, is there a digital version? No, because I'm a techno-jerk. My wife said to me, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, Schmuck, we have to get this digitized. And we started talking with people about it cost, I don't know, $25,000 or $30,000 or something. And I said, $25,000, $30,000, we can print a lot of maps. To answer your second question, which is not a happy question for me, the printed maps are probably more abundant. And I'm not that much of a, I might be a troglodyte, but I'm not a Luddite. But if I had my way, I would take everyone's iPhone and throw it in the garbage.
Well, we know where you're coming from. On the other hand, a book that I only briefly alluded to, New York Block by Block, is now in its 6th edition and does seem to have a market.
Well, maps are still selling. We have fewer and fewer outlets. But Barnes and Nobles carries the complete line of maps, etc. Book culture, Columbus, carry our maps. There's a stationery store in the village that carries our maps. But we used to have much wider distribution. I mean, every bookstore used to carry.
Turning to a different perspective on the subject, give us some insight in how a map maker looks at a map. Take, for example, one of the maps in our exhibition, and take us through what you're seeing when you look at the map.
First off, one of the things that Bob just did was jokingly talk about cartographer versus map maker.
John, talk a little louder.
I'm sorry. I do not call myself a cartographer. I call myself a map maker. I say the cartographers drop a lot of big words like longitude and latitude. I know uptown, downtown. So, with that perspective, what would be my favorite map out there?
Sure, start
The
with that.
1909 IRT map.
Yeah. And
So-
what are the first things you're seeing there?
The precision of that map is remarkable, and the level of detail is remarkable. And when you talk, when I did Manhattan block by block, for starters, it took me 3 years, because I walked every block in the city. And where I couldn't walk, such as getting off the Henry Hudson Parkway, my wife would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and we would drive the same exit over and over and over again until I thought I had it right. Having done that, and then having to, well, you know, I carried a clipboard with me when I went charting, and I would note every subject that interested me. I mean, it was a vainglorious undertaking when you think about it.
Max's autobiography.
I didn't do it with any objectivity. You know, if something interested me, I would jot it down. But I did try to record all schools, all houses of worship, all hotels. I would include primary apartment houses, you couldn't ignore the Dakota or the Majestic or anything of that nature. I would have all hotels, theaters, movie theaters, off-Broadway, Broadway, off-Broadway, you name it. And then try to condense that information to make it fit.
That's a trick, isn't it?
Yeah, I tried not to declare anything redundant that I thought important. And I don't, you know, this is not a land map. I do not have every lot and every building in the city.
It's not Sandwood.
Right. But I try to put things in perspective. One of the subjects that I was very careful about was restaurants. Because if you talk about a capricious business, it's restaurants. But I do have things like McSorley's Saloon.
Yeah.
I have the Landmark Tavern. I have P.J. Clark's. So you know my proclivities.
Let's turn to your most recent book, Manhattan's Little Secrets, which brings in a completely different kind of approach in that it goes from the micro to the macro in many cases, whereas many of your other works tend in the other direction. And so you hone in on architectural details, ornaments, various objects that you've observed around the city, and from there, very often it leads to a story on a very interesting dimension. For example, one of the early entries is for a sign that's below the frieze of 1 Broadway that simply says "First Class." And what does that have to do with the sinking of the Titanic?
Has anybody ever heard of the International Mercantile Marine?
What did you say?
International Mercantile Marine.
Yeah.
Yes.
It was a corporation begun by J. Pierpont. Because by the turn of the 20th century, Morgan and his allies basically controlled freight rates in the United States. They could not control freight rates on transatlantic steamers. So Morgan set out to buy up every seaworthy transatlantic steamship he could find. He even bought the White Star Line.
And
The
now,
one
one Broadway relates to IMM.
Yes, that was the headquarters of the International Mercantile Marine. And you'll see a sign that says first class, and another one to the west of it that says second class. And I think the third class or steerage was at the corner and down a few steps, but I'm not sure. So they built the building, they put their logo on it, IMM, and the only holdout that did not become under the wing of International Mercantile Marine was the Cunard Line. And the director of the White Star Line was prevailed upon to become the president of International Mercantile Marine. And it was J. Pierpont Morgan, basically, who built and owned the Titanic.
And so did this attempt at monopoly work?
No. We have to remember Teddy Roosevelt and his trust busting.
Right.
And there was a second thorn in Morgan's side. The European ship sellers knew a good thing when they saw it. They, there's a sucker born every minute, right? And Morgan, this time, was the sucker. He bought it probably twice the worth of these steamship lines or individual steam lines. And by 1912, he was on the verge of bankruptcy. And he sold them back and lost a fortune.
So why is the Dakota called the Dakota? There's a detail, architectural, ornamental detail on the Dakota showing an Indian chief, perhaps Sioux, I think you mentioned, and which relates to the name of the building. And so tell us about the name of the building as well as how the Dakota fits into residential living history in New York.
Well, there are two great stories about the naming of the Dakota. The first one is the good one. And I have to preface it by saying, never let a bad fact get in the way of a good story. A man named Edward Clark, who was a lawyer, represented Mr. Singer of the Singer Sewing Machine Company. And Singer was frequently being sued, and he was frequently sued. He was a very litigious man. And Edward Clark wound up working for him full-time, and he became a vice president of the Singer Sewing Machine Company. Well, Mr. Singer died, and Edward Clark became the president. He had been making a ton of money. He had been buying block after block of Upper West Side real estate. And he decided that he was going to build an apartment house on 72nd Street, on Central Park West between 72nd and 7th. It was basically a bit of a square with a hole in the center for a courtyard. And Singer was an affable man, and he went to one of his clubs and was having dinner, and one of his dining companions said, "Eddie, I hear you're building a building up so far away from civilization, it might as well be in the Dakota Territory." Now, Clark was amused, but that's not why it was called the Dakota. Clark, for some bizarre reason, and I've never been able to find out why, liked Western names. He built an apartment house called the Yosemite, and there's a second building called the Yosemite on the site, 7th Avenue, 52nd Avenue. So just, he wanted to name 8th Avenue, 9th Avenue, and 10th Avenue after Western names. He wanted Central Park West to be something like Idaho Place. He wanted what became Columbus Avenue, I don't know, Cherokee Avenue or something, on and on. And he just named the Dakota because what had been discovered in them far hills of Dakota, gold. And what is, you talked about the social aspects of the Dakota. In the 1880s, if you were a proper upper middle class New York resident, the odds are that you lived either in a private home, in a row house, or if you were wealthy enough, a freestanding house, or you lived in a hotel. And you would eat in the hotel dining room. People did not live in apartments as we know them. And there was a pejorative to people who did. They were called French flats because it was sort of foreign and exotic and French.
Risque.
Risque, precisely. And the average apartment dweller lived in a tenement, 4 apartments to the floor, 5 flights of floors, no bathing facilities, the public sink in the hallway, open for, usable for all the residents, and a privy out back. That was what it meant to live in an apartment in New York in the mid-19th century. However, in the 1880s, first-class apartment houses started going on. The Chelsea, today's Chelsea Hotel on 23rd Street was originally a cooperative apartment house. The Gramercy on Gramercy Park East was another cooperative apartment house. And the Dakota opened in 1884 as a rental, not a co-op. The virtue of a co-op is that you can have a band of friends create a board and keep out those who are deemed unworthy. And you can also rent out less than first-class spaces within and, you know, get revenues from rentals. So it can be a money-making, profitable undertaking. The Dakota was strictly a rental. And what's interesting is to look at the New York Social Register. I guess it was the first one was 1889. How many addresses are 1 West 72nd Street? So many prominent New Yorkers wanted to move into the Dakota. And the Dakota had apartments. There were 8, 10, 12, 14 rooms. You know, it's not a skyscraper. The walls of the Dakota are 3 feet thick in the basement. There are iron supports for the ceilings. But it was in such demand that a row of row houses was built on the north side of 73rd between Central Park West and Columbus. And they would be rented to people on a temporary basis, awaiting an apartment in the Dakota.
Sounds familiar. Well, it sounds like almost overnight, apartment living became respectable.
That's right. By the turn of the 20th century, apartment living was considered respectable. In Howells, Dean Howells, is that his name? The Boston writer?
William
Dean Howells. He wrote a book about, it was sort of autobiographical, about moving from Boston to New York and the ordeal of finding an apartment that was respectable. This is in the 1880s. You know, the odds, we forget 2nd, 3rd, 6th, and 9th Avenues had elevated railroads operating.
Right.
And
Which were extremely noisy, smoky, you name it.
yeah, you know, they weren't electrified until the turn of the 20th century.
Right.
And I mean, I remember being in people's apartments on 3rd Avenue when the L would go by. All conversation would stop. The china would rattle in the china closet. The pickings were slim.
Right. We're running out of time, and before John takes some questions, I'd like to finish with what would you suggest our guests after they leave this evening off into the New York night, pay closer attention to in the few blocks radius of here that they might not have noted before?
All right, the first thing you should do is go into the St. Regis Hotel and just look at the Cutler mailbox. You know, Cutler was actually an architect, a licensed architect in Rochester, New York, and he developed a mail chute so that if you were on the 3rd floor, you only had to take your letter and drop it down the chute. It would go down the chute into a mailbox, a letterbox as they call it. And along would come an employee of the United States Postal Service, unlock the door to the box, take out the mail, put it in the bag, and take it to the mail, to the post office. Cutler patented his mail chute, but he did not have a patent on the letter boxes. And by the early 20th century, affluent builders were asking their architects to custom design the letterbox box that would be in the lobby of their buildings.
Mm.
And the
Kind of
same
a signal of how snazzy the building and the
That's
hotel
right.
is.
And the St. Regis is pretty snazzy.
Yeah, I
And
remember from the
it's
book.
perhaps the most baroque, over-the-top, unga pachka mail letterbox in the city. Also, you know, if you're at the St. Regis, you should go into the Old King Cole Bar, because that painting by Maxwell Parrish is not original to it. It was originally in another Astor-owned hotel, the Knickerbocker, which is was on the southeast corner of 42nd and Broadway. And it was commissioned by Colonel John Jacob Astor, who was the great-grandson of the founding father. And Max was very proud of it. They had it there in the bar on the corner of 42nd and Broadway. But what happened to bars under the Volstead Act and Prohibition, they had to close down. And since so many hotels are dependent on revenue from restaurants, and restaurants are dependent on revenue from the bar service, many hotels went belly up in the 20s. You know, the Waldorf Astoria closed, for instance. The Knickerbocker Hotel was metamorphosed into an office building. It's since been revivified as a hotel. And Old King Cole was put in storage. He was then installed in the Tennis and Racket Club on Park Avenue. And then when the extension to the St. Regis was built, they installed it in a bar there, called it the Old King Cole Bar. If you get up to 59th Street, east of 2nd Avenue, you'll see one of my favorite subjects in the book. It's a mosaic. To place it, it's between 2nd and 1st Avenue, south of the Manhattan entrance to the Queensboro Bridge. And it's a mosaic with a fountain at its base, and it was officially called Abundance. And there's a very elegant woman with a cornucopia with fruit flowing from it. And that mosaic and fountain had originally been within the market under the ramp of at the Manhattan end of the Queensboro Bridge. And it was put there by a woman named Evangeline Blashfield, who was married to one of the most successful muralists in the 1890s and early 20th century, Edwin Blashfield. He did the ceiling in the Library of Congress. He originally did the original ceiling in the ballroom, the original ballroom. He did a triptych at the Appellate Division on 25th and Madison. And he painted the cartoon for the mosaic, and Evangeline Blashfield paid for it. She also paid for it. And the middle name Wilbur looms large in New York history. Her father was a Brown, he had attended Brown. He was a reporter for the New York Herald. When he was 30 years old in the 1860s, he was proficient. We were talking about being proficient in French. He was proficient in French enough to translate Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. And that translation was the modern library standard until 1909. That's the translation I read, and I was an English lit major. By the late 1860s, early 1870s, Joseph Wilbur was embarked in a printing and stationery business. Very successful. His wife, Phoebe, was in the vanguard of the women's voting movement. She read the platform in the Women's Convention in 1869 advocating the right for the women to vote. People like Elizabeth Cady Stanton were regulars in the hall. So Evangeline grew up with all this. she married Blanchfield in Europe, where her family was then living. Why the Wilbur family moved from New York to Paris?
John, I'm going to have to stop you there, and if anybody wants to continue that conversation, I want to leave some time for questions. I'm sure there's a few questions here. And then after the questions, if there are any, we're going to set up a little table where John's books will be available and maps, a signed Tauranac subway map, my God. And questions, please.
Yeah, would you concede that, going back to the Vignelli map, would you concede that there's some positive trade-off between the aesthetic and the ease of use versus the lack of proportionality in like Central Park being a square versus rectangle?
Well, this map doesn't tell you anything about the operation itself. So it's useless as a map.
The boxes with the codes, there were none in like
Pardon me?
boxes with the codes, the keys to the various
This
symbols.
This did have in the top right-hand corner a guide to the system, but it requires reading that and reading this at the same time, isn't it? A map should be more didactic than telling you that something stops there if it's a simple map.
So it's not, the map itself is not self-explanatory, it requires another layer.
Another layer. I mean, in order to look at my present maps and understand if you see something in red, it's more than a watch it. It means that there are steps to weekdays. You do have to refer to how to use this.
But in today's, you have to also go to the key to get the codes, the half moons and all those other symbols.
Today's map is not progressed in terms of being the level of didacticism as to the definition of part-time service from 1979, which I think is so short-sighted, and I've tried to get the attention of the TA to no avail. You know, it would be so easy to use my standards for color coding the service at each station, but they don't do it.
Questions?
John, have you finished Walking Manhattan, or is there a successor to this book?
Well, people ask me when I'm going to do Brooklyn. And the first thing I say is, remember, Brooklyn is 5 times as big as Manhattan. And that would take me 15 years to do. And I always think of Thomas Wolfe, who wrote a story called Only the Dead Know Brooklyn. The kicker is, because it takes a lifetime to learn it, I've spent a lifetime trying to learn Manhattan, and I haven't succeeded, so, no.
Well,
Nobody ever knows Brooklyn true and true.
True and true, right?
Yeah, you've succeeded in opening our eyes to a lot of Manhattan that we probably hadn't noticed as closely. So thank you very much, John.